So in the mid-90s, I was now a volunteer security officer, and I had the opportunity to either walk him, drive him, spend time with him, minutes, hours perhaps in a week. And those interactions were fascinating. Some of those events, by the way, in some of those years were very tense. And I was young. I didn't understand fully what was happening at the time, but there were definitely stressful moments, and he didn't hide his stress from me. And then there were times when we might sit in a VIP area that was cordoned off, perhaps at the airport, waiting for him to be the last to board a plane or the first to go through somewhere. And I had to make sure I always had good questions lined up.
She said to me, look, in future publications, can you take a look at them as well, just to cast an eye over them? You're not there to check the grammar, although frequently I did. And from then on, all the way through, not only through the rest of his chief rabbinate, and even when he left the chief rabbinate, and I think in 2013, I carried on doing that till he passed away tragically so early. But I think he'd want us to be very proud of our Yiddishkeit and not shy away from it at all.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shtark. Shtark is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Bnei Torah in the workforce. This is our 99th episode. Please keep a lookout for our 100th episode, a very special conversation, which will be coming to you next week. This week is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha. Last year, we had a very special series in his memory and remembering his legacy with regards to being a Bnei Torah in the workforce. And this year, we have one mega episode with two fascinating conversations coming your way. You're going to hear from Mr. David Frei, who worked with Rabbi Sacks doing editing on his books, as well as other things as well. But for now, we're being joined by Joe Himes. Joe has been a leader in Jewish leadership, in the world of tech and media as well. Joe, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Yaakov, for having me.
So first, I need to express Hakar Satov. The first time I had anything close to a job is when I was an intern at a place called Honest Reporting. And Joe believed in me and fed me wonderful lunches and took me on trips, and it was a lot of fun. I even once almost stole your iPad. I don't know if you remember that. But thank you, Joe, for giving me a start in the professional world, and I really appreciate that. But the reason why we're talking to you today is because well before you were a leader in these fields of media and nonprofit work and stuff like that, you had a very close relationship with Rabbi Sacks. So maybe tell us about the origins of that.
Yeah, for sure. I did have a close relationship, and it's one that I worked hard to try and to get close to him as a teenager. I was a student at JFS Jews Free School in London. As in senior year, I had the opportunity to go and meet the chief rabbi. And Rav Sacks was a very impressive person from my very first experience meeting him. And awe-inspiring in the sense of stepping into his home with a few of my few fellow students and having prepped some questions, none of which I remember, but this was certainly an opportunity presented to us as to meet the leader of the Jewish community at home and abroad. And I just remember being nervous. I don't remember what I asked. I just remember the sense like a regal sense of stepping into someone's home who was very princely in the way he addressed us and welcomed us, but very warm and inviting once that conversation got flowing. And after that one connection, as I continued in my own Jewish studies, wanting to spend a year in yeshiva, not being sure where to do that, and looking for some pocket money, I guess, in that last summer or the summer before the last year of high school, I started thinking to myself about going into Jewish studies, perhaps academically, professionally. I wasn't sure, but I wanted to spend more time with this great personality, this great man, this great leader that I'd bumped into, and books were being published and his name was all over the Jewish news. I was just impressed and enchanted in a way that I wanted to try and connect further. And little Joe Himes wasn't really going to have a shot at that unless I could find an excuse to be round and about him in the course of his ongoing weekly and monthly events, which were always attending, be it dinners, be it shivers, be it giving lectures, be it book signings. And an opportunity arose to join a volunteer network of security providers, those that would escort him to events, who would drive him, who would train to drive him efficiently and securely in tandem with the London police. And I was accepted into that program. And by my late teens, we're speaking now, what was it? Mid-90s. So in the mid-90s, I was now a volunteer security officer, and I had the opportunity to either walk him, drive him, spend time with him, minutes, hours perhaps in a week. And those interactions were fascinating. I could begin with any one of many, but if there's any in particular you want me to zoom in on, what kind of experience can I flesh out for you?
So Maybe we'll start with this. It's interesting, going back to the mid 90s, he was still very much a rising star. He had not yet gained the world renown that he has today. But you also mentioned that even back then, your first meeting with him, there was something so royal about him. So maybe you could talk about how he saw himself and how he viewed himself as someone who, on the one hand, seems to be so gracious and so humble, but also so majestic.
Yeah. So there's definitely something in the way he carried himself, in the way he was always so thoughtful and pensive. He almost spoke with his facial expressions, as in, once a question was put to him, that thinking, those eyebrows, that the beard, the sense of being fully present in your question, and the answer that flowed being so well developed and sincere. There was an aura of presence which was belied by the very humble and honest grandfatherly conversation that would flow, always with a smile, always serious, always sincere. And I think that the community gives, in a positive way, a veneer of kavod to its leader, and that leader can either magnify it to their own sense of self, or they can deflect it and be self-deprecating. And somewhere in between was a very sincere, appropriate walking with that kavod that was afforded him. And he earned it and then some. But nonetheless, approaching a front door, it would be Rabbi Sacks who would hold the door open for the person who he was with. And there could be some very confusing moments, at least for the person on the receiving end of that gesture, to not allow kavod of the Rav to walk through that door first. So there was a very real person, I think, wrapped in a community veneer of kavod that we all gave him, and it was duly earned. And where else do we get to experience such a sense of kavod? I'm not sure that we have any other examples. Perhaps lahavdil with ministers, MPs, members of parliament, and business leaders, but that's much more out of a sense of, to my mind, that would always be a sense of intimidation or fear of saying the wrong thing. I don't think I was ever fearful of saying the wrong thing or asking the wrong question with Rabbi Sacks. It was more just being aware that I'm about to take a few seconds of someone's time with this question. It better count it because he earned it being time well spent. I don't know if I've answered the question, but that was definitely my takeaway. Yeah.
And I love the fact that you sort of balanced the fact that his this aura around him, along with the fact that he was a very real person. And I'm wondering, like, I've always imagined, like, to be someone in his position, to be in the spotlight, on show so often in such an intense way with such scrutiny, not bad scrutiny, but just always being looked at. And then he finishes this event. He gets into the car. He's with you. Does he let his guard down? Is he a different person? Is he the same person? Is he still have to put on a show for Joe Himes?
Yeah. There's no show. I'll say it like this. The journey to the event was always more awkward for me, and not nothing that he did that made it awkward. Just it was my own take on the situation, where the protocol would always be, I guess, another regal veneer, that you don't speak until spoken to. Perhaps we should practice that more with our kids. I mean, that certainly wasn't something that he imposed. That was just the understanding. When you're driving someone of importance, you drive and you keep your mouth shut. And if someone asks you a question, you engage. And I was always very aware of those moments where, and it could be just minutes, it could be half an hour on a longer journey. I know that he's using that time to write his drasha, to collect his thoughts, to remind himself of the event. Some of those events, by the way, in some of those years were very tense. There was a lot of, I think, around the time of publishing Dignity of Difference, there was a lot of blowback from many corners about that book. And I was young. I didn't understand fully what was happening at the time, but there were definitely stressful moments. And he didn't hide perhaps his stress from me, in the sense that he just wanted quiet time. He wanted to think. He might have to take a phone call. But there are other times that when he spoke, he would be very sincere and very honest. And there was certainly, on the approach to an event, I was aware that his mind was in where we were heading. And on the way home, there would be a relaxed reflection. I don't recall ever discussing post-event with him. It really, again, was none of my business. My job was to get him home safely. But nonetheless, it was always a very good, warm, good night. And he always tried to, I don't want to say always, I was aware that he was uncomfortable taking my time 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, that I should walk him all the way to his front door, as in, Joe, go home already, like your wife's waiting. It wasn't my wife, my family were waiting. It was a year after I think I was working with him that I was newly married. But he was always very aware that my time was precious as well. So there would be a bit of a jostle of, no, I'm going to walk you to the front door. That's my job. So he was very true. He was very real, beginning to end. There were some tough years, but even at those even in those times when I think there was stress around the book, and there were one or two other communal events, he had, I want to say, magic arms. He had the widest embrace of the community, left to right, where he just about, or he most certainly did, manage what others couldn't or hadn't, in keeping the left and right, and I'm using those terms with small l and r, really keeping the broad spectrum of the Jewish community under the umbrella of having covered for him, even if at the edges they were in disagreement. It's not a small thing to say that, and I'm not sure that in 2025 things would or could be the same. But in those years, he did a phenomenal job of making sure that there was a unified community and congregation under his auspices. And everyone loved him from all angles for being that broad, but being true to himself. He was a true broad centrist. And I'm saying that in as far as he was uncompromising as a strong religious leader without compromise, and nonetheless fully embrace with full heart and love and adoration those subjects of his community, of his kahila, which existed to the left of himself or others that were making life maybe hard for him at the time.
And I'm just trying to imagine you in that front seat of that car and the dual pressures. On the one hand, you have this generational leader that you're sitting just a few feet away from, and you want to give him the respect and the space, but also take advantage of any moments of opportunity on the one hand. On the other hand, you're also in charge of getting him from point A to point B safely, securely on the roads with other drivers. And I guess maybe London back then wasn't as hostile as it is now. We're not getting into that conversation, but you still have a public figure who could have bad people in the vicinity. So just what was that like for you, having that double pressure from both sides?
Yeah, it was stressful, not least because sometimes the car wasn't always familiar to me. Maybe whoever drove it last had put the seat higher or lower, like small things. And you want the experience to be comfortable and smooth. And there's always the what ifs, and you're never working alone. There are always people in the chain of command and concern and care for him from beginning to end. And on arrival, there would always be the pomp and ceremony of receiving the chief rabbi. And I was just little Joe at his side, but I felt safe once I got there because I knew there was an event waiting to receive him. It was pressurized. I mean, it goes with the training that if you have to use anything that you learned, then something went wrong. As in, the true measure of having trained well is that you anticipated and nothing went wrong. And I was very fortunate, thank God, in those years to be free of any trouble. Any trouble was anticipated and known and bypassed. If anything, I was more worried about the car breaking down. I wouldn't want to be stuck at the side of on the way to Heathrow Airport, the chief rabbi, by the crash barriers with the thumb out waiting for service. So I think I was just more, I was plotting about, well, what I do if like that kind of thing went wrong. And then there were times when we might sit in a VIP area that was cordoned off perhaps at the airport. I mean, I won't go into too many details, but there were times where we were face to face and waiting perhaps for him to be the last to board a plane or the first to go through somewhere. And I had to make sure I always had good questions lined up because you can't sit opposite someone and not speak. And he was very thoughtful in allowing me to ask questions. And he, despite having lots on his mind, gave me some guidance that even though I can't remember the words, I was inspired to go ahead and, for example, get into community service perhaps. He famously was not headed for the rabbinate. I mean, he speaks of his time meeting the Rebbe and in New York and being told against his own internal judgment that you're not going to do this, you're going to go ahead and be a community rabbi back in Cambridge. He almost allowed me to not have to worry about what track my high school and then university and career would be, but to rather go with what I sensed would allow me to give most to the community. And perhaps my ending up in Israel and some of my non-profit years of service came from that as well.
So I want to get into some of the big effects that he had on your life and your decisions. But before that, maybe any other small anecdotes or stories that you want to share with our listeners from those behind the scenes moments?
I would say that when I would escort him to an event, I would be a very different person than when perhaps a few years later I was a student at London School of Jewish Studies in my first year of undergrad, and I would then be effectively a student in a program that he was the head of. And that dynamic was strange. There was a dichotomy there. Going through a door as someone's security detail would always be, I would be the one to go through a door first. And it felt very uncomfortable to not say, after you, Rav, because who walks through a door before, well, you're Rav, let alone Rabbi Sacks. But he understood that that was my job. I walk through the door, I make sure there's no trouble the other side, and he would follow me through. But yet I had to remind myself when it came to any other circumstance of deference as a student going to lunch at Jews College, London School of Jewish Studies, after you, I had to remind myself that after you was now my default. But he was such a mensch, he would always go for the after you as his default, and that didn't matter where I went. So in effect, he was allowing me to just do my job when I was on detail with him. At least that's what I thought. But no, he would always want to have allowed someone else to step through the door before him. And as regal as a persona as he would carry into the room, he would still hold the door open for you. And that really endured. So he was very down to earth. The way he would speak to anyone from airline staff to catering people, anyone he would bump into on the way, there was a sincere, how are you? Thank you so much and good night. No less than he didn't want me to have to walk him down the driveway to his front door. He'd rather save me those few seconds. So he's very much a truly humble. He was very real. He was very real in the sense that when you through all of his books, you read him speaking as and I'm saying it with the greatest kavod, as a 20-something thoughtful young man having an outlook on life, never imagining himself to have become a 30, 40, 50 superstar in the communal sense. He was always that young man on the inside who wanted to just do good and keep building. I don't know if he was ever really comfortable having grown and emerged through his own efforts into the huge persona that he was. Bumped into him in New York, I think it was New York, perhaps Washington, one of the Jewish assemblies, and I forget which year, but he was just riding an escalator, reading a book, and I saw heads turning in the other direction. I mean, he's a face and a character that you can't miss. Like he could never be in disguise. And I'm imagining from his own thoughts, I'm just another attendee at this event of Jews coming to watch and learn and live and breathe everything that we care about. And there was never grandeur about it. He seemed very comfortable in America, I have to say. There was a sense of, perhaps he felt there was a measure of anonymity that he didn't enjoy in the much smaller closed community of London. And just always a smile on his face, just very down to earth.
You spoke of him as a real person, and this is maybe a technical detail. I'm just fascinated by it. Like, you would walk through a door. Would you have to like nod or have a certain protocol with him to allow him to come in? And maybe broadly speaking, did Rabbi Sacks have to participate in any sort of like security training for various scenarios that might come up with him in distress or in danger?
I won't say too much about it, but he understood full well that what the security detail would advise, there wasn't going to be a conversation. And he had enormous trust. We were never a pain or an annoyance. He understood full well why we were there. And we understood full well why measuring and maintaining as much privacy and distance as we could was important. I remember being very mindful of perhaps his dinner time, and there were things going on in the kitchen, and I could smell the dinner was almost ready, and I was conscious of not taking up more time than I needed to get in or to get out, or to have him home, to have him back. And I watched real family life in these small vignettes, from inside his home. And Elaine always just so warm and welcoming. Hi, Joe, how are you? And it was sincere. I wasn't just a doorman or a driver in those few moments. I felt like a guest. I wasn't a guest. I was there working, but I was a guest, and they meant it. And they were a very warm and real family in that sense. So the protocols themselves were known and trusted, but I never felt for a moment that he resented or felt uncomfortable with what was going on around him. He wore it very well. Very well.
It's really special just to hear another angle, a more intimate angle. And I know that not everything is for public discussion. We can also speak after the recording and make our listeners jealous.
Yeah, thank you.
But so let's just transition for the last part of this conversation to tell us a little about how, you've had a career with a few different stages and transitions. So maybe tell a little bit about Rabbi Sacks' influence that you can look back on in retrospect, about how your conversations or even just his ideas led you to make your big life decisions in your career.
Yeah, for sure. The two big decisions that were which were taking shape at the time I was working with him or learning alongside him, were heading to yeshiva, potential marriage, and then potential career. As in, if I were to continue my Jewish studies, which I'd become more serious about in the years prior as a late teenager, that would mean a year in yeshiva, and I headed off to Hamivtar. And then it was a question of, right, well, now do I head to some professional career in business, medicine, whatever it might have been? or do I just focus on continuing Jewish studies? And at the time, a second year in yeshiva wasn't an option. I was also very much into the creative arts. Photography was, I went on to study later on, but I wanted to come back and do something more serious in the sense of limud. And I was at Jews College only for a year before I switched out to photography. But his guidance and his conversations and his writings, I realized he was someone who was set on a very formal professional path, who understood that the world was a bigger place and the need was greater than the look or the expectation. And even though I had no firm expectations coming upon me from my family, I'd done very well at school. I was the head boy at JFS. It was a given that I would head to a top university and choose a top flight professional career. But I wasn't done learning and I wasn't done deciding. And I'd already met my now wife of 28 years almost, Sharon. At high school, she'd switched from Hasmonean to JFS. She also spent a year in Israel, Bnei Akiva, Midresha Arova. And I don't remember exactly how I asked him about when's the right time and who's the right person. I wasn't asking dating advice, but it was very clear there was tension between all of these events and interests that were happening sooner than perhaps the ordinary Anglo-British, the Anglo world would expect a succeeding young man to go ahead and continue his career. The expectation would be another few years, at least, of formal study and who knows what. Anyway, he allowed me, in the same way that he'd listened to a wider voice or he'd listened, or he was open to a broader call from the community, it allowed me to feel comfortable not knowing where I might go professionally and yet give some time to Jewish studies. And that in time moved on to Aliyah, getting married younger than we may have, honest reporting, teaching I was involved with for some time. I really enjoyed teaching and that helped pay the bills in the early years of marriage. And he just signaled to me that even from the very top in the professional sense, as I saw him and recognized in him that, his Cambridge career, his accolades, everything about him suggested a professional top flight direction, as we would describe it from the outside. And along had come the Rebbe and said, not so fast, like look around you. Don't think what it is you're supposed to become, ask what it is that you can become and add value. And that gave me a sense of permission, reassurance, comfort, knowing that whatever might present itself doesn't have to be measured by what should be, rather what could be and what is needed in the now. And that led on to everything from advertising to honest reporting to media to Israel. And none of those things were traditional or to be expected, but the gemishut, the flexibility to read the room of the situation, which was very much that was his magic measure. If anything, he could read a room and he knew what needed to be said, what needed to be heard, and what needed to not be said. And I think that I'm just saying this out loud with you now, reimagining or remembering that it was his ability to look a room in the eye and it know that he understood them wherever they were, that they felt heard, they felt that he was a real person for them in that moment. And anything could become of it. It didn't matter the subject and it didn't matter the consequence of that meeting. So I think he gave me that sense of read each day as it comes, make plans, but don't be so wedded to them, and just be down to earth, however high you may end up flying, which he certainly did. And he's sorely missed. I was shocked actually to hear of his passing. When he was nifter, I was not really in touch with the community or news, and it was a long shadow, but that morphs into a warm set of memories that I'm sharing with you now. I've not really explored them in a long time. So thank you for giving me this chance to share them with you.
Thank you for coming on and thank you for sharing them. And it is really, really quite touching. Any other war memories that you want to share with our listeners before we let you go?
Nothing in particular stands out, but I can't get over just the majestic look of his face, the way that he could speak to you without speaking. When I say to you, I don't remember, I've said a few times, I don't remember the questions, and often I don't remember the answers. But his face would give you a response that often was all you needed. The words wouldn't have mattered. And I think that glowing warmth, that radiance that he gave off in his smile, and it was a serious smile. It was a piercing smile. It was like it was a sharp love. There aren't really words to describe it, but there was an engagement and intensity of his just giving you his attention that mattered more than the answer you'd hoped for. And I just think that's going to be my lifelong memory of Rav Sacks.
Joe Himes, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing these really, really precious memories. And now we're going to transition to our conversation with Mr. David Frei. We're joined by Mr. David Frei, who has a background in law as well as Jewish communal work, and also worked very closely with Rabbi Sacks. So it's an honor to have you here, David, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So before we get into your relationship with Rabbi Sacks and your collaborations, your work with him, maybe let's start with a little bit of personal and professional background about yourself.
Right. So I was born in London. I'm a first generation Briton. In other words, both parents were born abroad. Some was Holocaust survivors. My mother arrived in this country about 2 weeks before the Second World War with her parents. My father came to England in 1947, having gone through every day of the war. He arrived in England in early 47. I was brought up in a Jewish district. I'm still there in Hendon, it's called, in northwest London. I studied law at University College London, got a law degree there. I was acting as a lawyer, solicitor for those who are English, Americans, just known as an attorney or a lawyer. Specialized in property litigation for about 20 years in the centre of London in the West End. And then I had a massive career change and I took on a job at the London-based inn, which is the oldest, actually I say probably second oldest based in England, certainly the primary one. The Sephardim actually arrived in England when Jews were allowed back in England, having been expelled in 1290. The Sephardim got here first. The Ashkenazim didn't take that much longer to come here. And community is much, much larger than the Sephardic, the Spanish and Portuguese community. And I became the administrator of that based in. I still am there. But I've got an additional job, which I took on a number of years after being in position, which was to be the legal director of the United Synagogue, which is a very large charity. It's the largest synagogal charity in England. It has about 57 shuls, mainly in the London area, but some in regions as well. The chief rabbi sits on top of all this. Actually is technically normally the head of the London basin as well, although on a functional basis we have our Rosh based in Abdan Geli. So my function is to administer that based in, but I'm involved in the side of Gittin, of Geirus, of Jewish status issues, of Erevin, all things like that, and Bnei Torah. So all the miscellaneous bits and pieces which the Beis Din does. And Bati Din, these communal Bati Din are much more comprehensive than the average Beis Din, for example, in Israel or in America, which may specialize only in divorce, such as in Eretz Yisrael, or only in Bnei Torah, with many Bati Din, both America and Israel, just do Bnei Torah only. We do virtually everything for the community, run the whole gamut of Erevin, Vos, anything you can think of to do with Jewish religious life. And we service a very large community.
Wow. So before we get into your relationship with Rabbi Sacks, I always try to plug Keren B'Yavneh. You went to Keren B'Yavneh way before it was cool, way before my father was there. So maybe tell us a little bit about your experiences there and how you decided way back before the year in Israel was like a popular and accepted thing to go to yeshiva in Israel and to go to Keren B'Yavneh, and how that experience shaped your life long term.
And so I arrived in 1972 and I stayed for 2 years. But in the middle of all that was this catastrophic war, the 1973 war. And when we look back on the recent war and the terrible tragedy, the contrast is so great. There were more casualties in 3 weeks in that war in 1973 than there were in the whole war that we've just been through. I mean, actual fatalities and injured. And Keren B'Yavneh itself was devastated with about at least 7 or 8 people killed. I mean, I knew all the people who killed. I would say 7 or 8 because there were 1 or 2 alumni whom I didn't know. There are still Bogrim of Keren B'Yavneh, but of my colleagues, I mean, I knew 7 people. Their names are still in my Yom Kippur Machzor till to this day. And the effect on Keren B'Yavneh was massive, not only because of the fatalities, but also because the yeshiva was almost in an empty mode for almost the whole of the winter Zman. So we talk about the end of, from October 73 all the way through to Pesach. The only people in yeshiva, because all the boys were being called up, mainly in occupation of the other side of the Suez Canal, the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal, which they'd captured in the war, and they remained there in tanks, waiting for disengagement talks, which took place. Henry Kissinger was involved with to and from diplomacy. And it was only close to Pesach in 1974. So the whole of that winter's Zman, that the yeshiva was, during the whole time, the yeshiva was virtually empty, apart from obviously the first year boys who hadn't yet started their Hesder, the Chutz La'aretz boys who weren't in the army, and some of the older boys were what they called Kaf Lamadim. They were not able to do combat, and so they weren't called up. So I wouldn't say the yeshiva was totally empty, but the soul of it was missing because so many people were in Sinai. And in fact, many of them Ramim there would go on a weekly basis to Sinai to give them shiurim because they had nothing to do. They were in occupied territory. They had occupied it, and until the disengagement was enacted, they had nothing to do with themselves other than to learn. And they did learn. And the boys would learn, go to the yeshiva there, and the Rami would go down from time to time to give them shiurim.
It's a long drive from Kerem to the Suez Canal, but I'm sure those were very special experiences for everyone involved, and powerful to hear the echoes of the current reality. I started the first year of the war in Kerem Biavne, and to hear how its history somewhat is circular and cyclical in that way is very interesting. So let's get into Rabbi Sacks. Maybe tell us about the first time you ever met Rabbi Sacks. What was your first impressions of him? And then we can get into how you guys work together.
So my first contact with him wasn't actually within the context of my job at all. It was some years before I started my job, and I'm trying to remember the year. I don't remember which year it was. It was either in the late 80s or early 90s when he, wearing his London School of Jewish Studies or Jewish College hat, because he was, before he became chief rabbi, he was head of Jewish College. He ran a series of modern orthodoxy lectures on a Sunday morning. At the time, I was working in the centre of London in law. I have absolutely no idea why I was invited to participate in this particular series, but it was very, very interesting. It was a monthly series. Every month he would bring in almost always from abroad, except I think he gave one of the lectures himself, but some scholars, chiefly from the United States, once or twice from Israel, to speak on topics to do with modern orthodoxy. And that's really the first time I came across him, but it wasn't really a personal contact as such. He was the person who was convening this series, and he gave one of the lectures himself. When I first got to know him was when I was being interviewed for the job which I still occupy today, and that was in the sort of summer and autumn of 1999, when I went through a whole series of interviews. I had been approached by Dayan Entros, who was the head of the Bezdin at the time, to take over a position as administrator. They call it here the registrar of the London Bezdin. And I'd been through any number of interviews. I met him. I met his colleague Dayanim at the time. I met the president of the United Synagogue, who is the nominal head, the lay head of the charity, the United Synagogue, which employs the Dayanim that are based in. I met the chief executive of the United Synagogue and had to meet the chief rabbi. So I think you can probably become president of the United States with less of a congressional hearings than I had to go through. And I went to my interview with Rabbi Sacks to his house. He lived in a house which chief rabbis always lived in at the time. They've since sold it, and the current chief rabbis moved to a more Jewish area. But the house was in St. John's Wood in a very, very large building in a street called Hamilton Terrace. And we sat at this small table in the middle of the large house and had a chat. He was very, very genial. I think he was basically, he had to interview me, but when Dayan Entros recommended me, and the Dayanim said they're happy with me, and the other people were happy with me, he wasn't going to veto it. So it was a pleasant conversation. We didn't go very far. It didn't take very long either. But this was really my first one-on-one with Rabbi Sacks. I saw quite a lot of him, obviously, in the ensuing years.
So what was the working relationship like with him? What types of things were you interacting with him about? And I want to specifically get to your editing, which you did. I don't know if that's an official part of the registrar's job. I doubt that. So how did that become that relationship of you are helping out with the actual Torah content?
Yeah, so the story is, first of all, I would say Rabbi Sacks, as a chief rabbi, did not spend that much time in the office. We're in an office in a suburb of London, northwest London, called North Finchley. And he was living in St. John's Wood, which is 6-7 miles down the road. And his office was there, and they worked 5 days a week in this office. But he rarely was there. He would either meet people at home or he would work from home. He would come into the office maybe once or twice a week. He preferred to work from home. He was very, very much a person who liked the quiet and who liked the study as well. In terms of, he was very into meeting major personalities of the non-Jewish and Jewish world. And he would prefer to invite them to a place in St. John's, which was quite near the centre of London. It was more convenient for them than it was to drag them out to some humble set of offices as it then was in North Finchley. So I didn't see that much of him. And when he was in the office, our offices were very close to each other geographically, and they still are. I mean, I'm still just a few yards down the corridor from the current chief rabbi. Our offices were doing different things. The chief rabbi is doing mainly outreach stuff. I mean, in terms of interacting with the wider community, he's visiting schools, he's speaking at charity events for all the different charities, gamut of the Jewish community. He is obviously in contact with the rabbis of the synagogues of which he is chief rabbi, and that's his function, is really to be the rabbi of the rabbis, to help in selecting them, to be a mentor for them, to induct them when they join a new community, and to generally be there for them and for the community. And he's clearly a person who's expected to do a lot of speaking, a lot of writing. And this area of work really didn't cross with our area of work at all. We are doing the everyday nuts and bolts of halachic processes, where there's geirus, where there's Jewish status issues, allowing people for marriage, and looking at people's personal status, mamzerus issues. There's Bnei Torah. There were Gittin, of course, a very, very major issue. So these were the everyday activities which he didn't get involved with. However, he would meet with the dayanim, usually on a weekly basis, and we would discuss issues, not individual cases, because that wasn't the point, but any issues which had halachic or policy considerations, what was going on in the shul, what was going on in the community generally, relationships with other synagogal bodies, those sort of things we did discuss with him, and that's where I saw him in action, so to speak, but not so much on a personal level, other than part of a group of people meeting with him in a meeting. But it wasn't a large group.
And then you also were responsible for reviewing some of his writings and helping prepare those for print. How did that come to be?
So I came to the Besna in 1999, and my role here started in 2002. So what happened is a book called The Dignity of Difference, which he had written. In this book, I think he wanted to bring it out on the anniversary of 9/11, which had happened in 2001. And he wanted to show the world that religions don't have to be in great conflict with each other. You don't have to blow yourself up in order to achieve spiritual refinement. He wanted to show there was another way, the voice of toleration, the voice of moderation. And that's what this book was intended to do. It wasn't a book intended specifically for the Jewish community. It was certainly aiming for a much wider audience. And this book, as I say, he wanted to get out with a particular anniversary in mind. And he had proofreaders at the time who would look over his writings, colleagues, people who check for the grammar, people who check for the content. And during the summer of the problem is, as you know, September was the month in which the anniversary fell. And preceding September, you've got summer holidays when hardly anybody's around. And I don't know who did proofread this book or who had reviewed it, but the book was a bit of a public relations disaster. When it first came out in the first few weeks, there was no comment at all, generally speaking. Then a group of rabbis, I think in the Manchester area in the north of England, decided that they had seen things in the book which they believed to be sacrilegious, almost blasphemous, the suggestion that no religion has a monopoly on the truth, and that there's truth in all religions, various comments such as that, which offended them greatly. And they gave this quite a lot of publicity, as a result of which he felt constrained to sit down with one of the dayanim and actually rewrite only the few so-called offending passages, which had caused so much grievance to these rabbis in North Manchester. What then happened is that the left wing thought this was quite ridiculous, that he's kowtowing to the right-wing fanatics and extremists, so he got stick from them as well. And that really wasn't a very pleasant situation. This came at the end of a poor summer for him, because this wasn't the only incident which really gave him a knock. I mean, this is nothing to do with my proofreading anymore, but earlier in that summer, he had also given an interview to a major British newspaper, a national newspaper called The Guardian, which is a left-wing, so it started as a liberal, became quite a left-wing newspaper. And they were never sympathetic towards Israel the last 20, 30 years. And till today, they are more obstructive and more oppositional than ever. But they gave him an interview, and I'd never heard the whole interview. I've seen bits of it in the article which was written. But the main point was, at some stage during the interview, he must have said something about doesn't necessarily agree with everything that the Israeli army does. And they turned that into the salacious headline they were looking for: Chief Rabbi doesn't like or criticizes the Israeli army. And this didn't go well. It didn't go down well at all in Israel, as you can well imagine, where the army is the sacred cow. You cannot do that. The security of difference and came about a month or two after the incident of the Guardian article, and in the autumn of 2021, it was his worst time ever. There's no question. He was very, very depressed about it, pondering the future, wondering whether he should carry on or not. Anyway, during this time, chief executive, a wonderful woman called Simma Weinberg, she lives in Israel now in her retirement, she said to me, look, in future publications, can you take a look at them as well, just to cast an eye over them? You're not there to check the grammar, although frequently I did, because that's what I do when I'm proofreading anything. If I find anything which I find doesn't quite fit in, I noticed this mistakes that's something about a very quick read, and I don't miss a word. And from then on, all the way through, not only through the rest of the chief rabbinate, because remember, it wasn't part of my job description. She asked me to do it, and it wasn't something I was doing at the very beginning, as you've heard. And even when he left the chief rabbinate, and I think in 2013, I carried on doing that till he passed away tragically so early. So I continued to do this job, and almost every book he wrote after that time, every article he wrote, and he was writing every week for Common Conversation for a number of years now, some of them being put into books. I was reading those regularly, weeks and weeks ahead, and checking them. And my role was to really make sure that no trouble is going to come out of this, that you should avoid controversy. There should be no more knocking down the doors and saying, what on earth are you talking about? So that was my role.
Wow. And were there any times where you guys disagreed, where there was something that you thought one way and he thought the other way? And was he receptive to the feedback in general? Was he humble or very insistent on his ideas?
No, first he's a humble person. He really was a humble person. And many of the things I pointed out were not major things. There were suggestions, advice about how you might want to put this. For example, when in one particular book, I can't remember which, he talked about evolution and the age of the universe. And I said, look, it's all very well you can put that, but have an appendix at the back, which he did do, to show what the rabbinic basis is for evolution. There are halakhic minds who have actually accepted this and have written on it. Just do that so that you're covered. And he accepted that and introduced that. In the main, most of my, there was very little wrong with what he wrote. I have to say this. But occasionally when there were some factual mistakes or better ways of putting things, citing a particular, because it's not a midrashic, and this is drush. There's so many kinds of conversations are drush. And in drush, it's never necessarily an absolute truth. Midrashim themselves argue about all sorts of things. This week's Sedra, other Sedras, you will find different midrashim. But if you are going down a particular line and plugging a particular line, you sometimes have to just point out to the reader that there are other views on the way this passage is looked. Those are the main points I would raise, and he would always take these on board. There were one or two occasions when I just didn't agree, and we agreed to disagree. I mean, I can give you an example. It's quite funny because I was looking back in preparation for today, and some of my emails going back a decade or so, but this email actually was more only from 4 years ago, 2021, when he had already passed away. Koren were working on the Chumash, which has actually just been published in the last few weeks. And they were, of course, trying to put together a commentary on the Chumash based on his communal conversations, because it was a work he had started off to do, and unfortunately, his tragic illness at the end cut short his work on that Chumash, so they had to do the work themselves, gleaning it from various extracts from communal conversation and comments he'd made in Drashot. And his Drashot were a pleasure to read, of course. They were a delight to read. So, funny enough, they sent me just simply a sample of one of his commentaries, which I'd seen many times before when I'm reading his, and it was from Parshat Toldot, to 2 weeks' time. I wrote back, and these are the words of my emails in 2020. I wrote back to his staff saying, I personally always felt a little uncomfortable that this. I said, the one email, the one article you're going to show me, the one extract you're going to show me, is the one which makes me least comfortable. I said, I've always personally felt a little uncomfortable about the Lord Rabbi Sacks' thesis that Yaakov had a complex about wishing to be his brother and only realized his potential after the clash with the angel representing Esav in Parshat Vayishlach. And I said I've made similar comments in the past when reviewing covenant conversation. Well, I made that point. It went ahead anyway. And Another area I didn't agree, but you can have views on this, was his view on slavery. He was writing for an audience which was not necessarily religious, sometimes even non-Jews were reading this as well. And he wanted to stress that the Torah is against slavery. And he drew on certain aspects of the way in which you treat a slave. I mean, first, for some, he didn't always make the distinction between Eved Ivri and Eved Kanani. That's one point. But secondly, even with Eved Kanani, he was really making out as if the world wasn't yet ready to emancipate all its slaves, but it had that intention, and it was going along that in that direction, and just trying to get you ready for it. And I didn't see any indication of that in the Torah. It's sort of olam ba'em ta'avodo, that you mustn't even free your slave. And the Gemara talks about various instances where people did free their slaves and asked how could they do so. I didn't see that indication, but he clearly was writing for an audience that wanted to hear this sort of thing. But I didn't agree, and I made that. I made that point, and he went ahead anyway. And he didn't get into trouble for either. There's 2 points, by the way. So there were occasions when we disagreed. For the vast majority of the time, there's absolutely nothing to disagree about, just to make helpful comments.
And I am fascinated that you mentioned the appendix to the book, The Great Partnership, mainly because I remember reading it specifically in the plaza dormitory of Keren B'Yavneh and being blown away by that particular section. So I guess I can now have the chance to say Akar Satov to you for making that suggestion, and it was certainly a really mind-blowing experience. So thank you, and that's very, very interesting. I just want to go back a little bit. You mentioned the genesis of your role being this summer of 2002, where there were these 2 crises that rocked Rabbi Sacks and his office and his stature in the community, which is fascinating. Now he's revered by so many people in the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world. And again, it's interesting to think how going back, 20 years before his passing, there was this real crossroads. Can you talk a little more about how he handled that controversy and how he was able to find the resilience to move forward despite what seemed to have been a very difficult period?
Well, I think initially it did knock him, but he got back onto his feet and he continued writing, continued preaching, and he has so much to offer that it's just healed itself. He grew a following, and I think he grew that following through his writing, through his speaking. I mean, you don't find many better orators in the world today than he was. An outstanding orator, and he was an outstanding writer, which is such a rarity to find both those qualities in one person. You can hear fantastic orators who can't put pen to paper at all, and vice versa. People who've written brilliant books, but they stand up and they stammer and blabber all over the place. And he was absolutely articulate. He was word perfect. He was really a fantastic speaker and writer. Truth will out. People see quality when they confront it. There was also the point that he left the chief rabbinate in 2013, so 7 years before he passed away. At that stage, he had far more time. He was freed from the bother, if you like, of going to these tiny communities, dying on their feet in little parts of rural England. And he was able just to simply write and teach and appear at places and study, teach at university, and it gained a much wider audience than just merely the parochial audience of the UK, which was big in itself. I mean, in the UK, he became a major personality. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. If you look now, I've been to a few tributes to him in the last few years since his passing away. There have been 3 of them that I've attended. One involved a conversation between Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister of this country for umpteen years, and he had a conversation with someone called Matthew Dancona, who is a major journalist, in memory of Rabbi Sacks. And this was hosted by the late Jacob Rothschild, a lord, aristocrat of the highest order, not religious at all. And he was in a stately home in Britain called Spencer House, related in some ways to the family of King Charles's first wife, Diana Spencer. Grand building just off Piccadilly, beautiful venue. And you have, a non-Jewish prime minister talking in terms of just absolute admiration of our rabbi. And then 2 years ago, in 2004, I went to a lecture just before Pesach given by Tony Blair's successor as Prime Minister, a guy called Gordon Brown, brilliant speaker as well. And he spoke for about an hour and a quarter without a note in front of him, pacing up and down the stage. But his admiration for Jonathan Sacks, for whose one of his books he actually wrote the foreword, was extraordinary. And this year, just before Pesach, again at King's College London, There was another memorial lecture, this time given by a former Archbishop of Canterbury. This is head of the Church of England, a guy called Rowan Williams. And I mean, this was just unbelievable, just to hear the respect that he had for Jonathan Sacks and his knowledge as well of Jewish theology. I mean, to hear Rowan Williams quoting Rabbi Soloveitchik a few times, just mind-blowing. I mean, this is the head, the Galach, the head of the Church of England. And if you see the sorts of places where Jonathan Sacks attended during his lifetime, both as chief rabbi and afterwards, it is absolutely extraordinary. You ask somewhere about his impact on the public square. You cannot begin to imagine how influential he was. Very shortly after I joined the Beth Inn in June 2000, I was invited by Simmer Weinberg, the chief executive of his office, to a meeting at Windsor Castle, the home of the royal family, for a meeting. It was called the St. George's Lecture. Now, there is a society called St. George's House. It's based on the chapel, the grand, beautiful chapel at Windsor Castle, in the grounds of Windsor Castle. And this is a group of Christian laymen, not priests, but professors of theology and people who run cathedrals and churches up and down the country. And they have a retreat every year at Windsor, and they always ask for a star speaker, and they invited him. And of course, he said, I can't speak. They normally speak in St. George's Chapel, where he said, well, we can't do that. Sorry. So instead, they did it in something called St. George's Hall, which is the longest room in Windsor Castle, a very long, narrow room going was the width of the castle. And sort of the length of the castle, I should say. I mean, the Duke of Edinburgh was the husband of the Queen, was presiding over this event. He was half a mile away from me, and right in the front on top table of Jonathan Sacks. And he gave a speech for about an hour and 15 minutes. It was fluent. It was full of stories, anecdotes, humor. And the guys around me, actually mainly Goyim around me, were absolutely spellbound by it. And this was his reach. This was his rage. It was amazing. And you just saw people in the public domain, they regarded him, especially in his later years, even after he finished with the chief rabbinate, as the power exemplar of brilliant speaking, of the ability to sell God. I mean, there was a guy, I wrote this down, looking back at it, I remember reading it. There's a guy called William Rees Mogg, he's not alive anymore. He was an editor of the Times, which is the quality paper of record of England. He had been chair of the governors of the BBC. So he's a very, very prominent Catholic layman. And he wrote some years ago, the voice of moral and spiritual leadership in Britain passes between different religious leaders in different generations. Today, Rabbi Sacks was the one who's best made the case for God. This is a Catholic who doesn't look to the Archbishop of Westminster, who is the man in charge of the Catholic Church in England, the Pope's representative. He doesn't look to the Archbishop of Canterbury. He looks to Rabbi Sacks, the head of a tiny community compared to the sort of numbers that they number among their followers. And that's what he was saying about our Rav. The influence he had was absolutely extraordinary.
So I want to jump in with another question here, because as you said, his light onto the nations was so bright, so remarkable, so unique. But for people like us who are Bnei Torah in the workforce, what can we take from his legacy and his thought that we can actually apply without being Rabbi Sacks, but to be on our own very micro level, someone who represents God and spreads the light of God and Torah values in the public square where we find ourselves on a day-to-day basis in our careers and our professions?
So it is very difficult because we don't have his erudition. We certainly don't have his great advantage in life was he was one of them. He was brought up within the British educational system. He didn't go to Jewish schools, and he went to the top universities in England, Cambridge and Oxford and Cambridge, and he spoke like them, sounded like them, talked like them, had the same educational background. I don't think we, who perhaps came from slightly more yeshivish backgrounds, have the erudition that he had to represent, certainly in a way that he was able to do. I mean, there are very, very few rabbis today that I can think of who would be invited to any of the forum that I just suggested, whether it's the St. George's Society at Windsor Castle, whether it's the Lambeth Conference of Anglicans. Very, very few rabbis who have that grasp. And it's possibly because he wasn't brought up yeshivish and he wasn't brought up learning Gemara. I mean, he said the first Gemara he ever learned was when at university with another student who had been to yeshiva. So we don't have the kalim, so to speak, other than to, as if you say he's Bnei Torah, then we have kalim only to first of all, be a Kiddush Hashem in everything we do, in honesty and integrity, to obviously treat people with utter respect, everybody we meet with. But much more than that, we don't really have the forum in which to spread the word, so to speak. But it is enough for us, I think, for people in the outside world to gain a Kiddush Hashem, or to make a Kiddush Hashem, simply by acting in the best possible way, to show that even though we do very crazy things to them, or we switch all electoral things on Shabbat and all this sort of thing, which they generally can't understand, but we do have a part to play. We don't swear in public. We dress in a sneeristic manner. We don't womanize in public. All these sort of things which goes on in the workplace. Religious Jews have certainly an ability to be Mekadashim Shemayim simply by doing what they're supposed to be doing and not doing what they're not supposed to be doing, more importantly.
So you transitioned at a certain point from being a lawyer to working in these Jewish communal bodies. Now, these institutions, they exist in different shapes and forms in America and England and Israel, but the various community institutions are so important, so critical. They also get criticized a lot, and they get a lot of flack from different people. So can you talk a bit about how Rabbi Sacks thought about the role, what they should be playing, where their limitations are, what they shouldn't be involved in as far as these big Jewish institutions?
Well, the main institutions he was interested in were schools. I mean, he wrote a lot about, will we have Jewish grandchildren? He was very into the fact that Jewish children should be in Jewish schools. And to be fair, during his chief rabbinate, a much larger section of the Jewish population, and I'm not talking about the frum population now, I'm talking about people who are nominally Orthodox, and even Reform, who wouldn't dream of sending his children to Jewish schools 50 years ago. Then the parents hadn't gone to Jewish schools, but they did send their children to Jewish schools. And this was what he was always aiming for. How much was due to his propaganda on this point, or how much it was due to the fact that London was being swamped by immigrants and, of all shapes and sizes, and it was perhaps safer from bullying, from racism, to be in a Jewish school. Also, Jewish schools, because public exam records are made public, Jewish schools were performing very, very well as against the state schools, which were taking in anybody. I mean, obviously there were other schools in this country, private schools, which for some anomaly England calls public schools. But when a public school in England is anything but public, it's a private school, very high fees paid for them. So Jews were always sending to those schools, and some do continue to do so to get the best education possibly for their children. But so there was a great increase in the Jewish population in Jewish schools. How much of a difference that has made in terms of observance, we're now hitting a new generation. There are two problems. Number one, some of these so-called Jewish schools are Jewish in name, and yes, they'll got a little bit of davening and a bit of this and a bit of that. But in the main, the Jewish studies provision, I'm talking about not the ones for the Haredi community or even the right-wing modern Orthodox community. I'm talking about the mainstream community, which in England is not Shomer Shabbos. These schools, even though they've got Jew in their name, they have very, very little Jewish studies provision. The kids that come out of there are not Jewishly literate in any sense of the term that we would regard as Jewishly illiterate, in terms of being fluent and being able to pick up a Chumash Rashi and understand it. And so I think if Rabbi Sacks would come back now, and I think he would be disappointed in a way that the community hadn't moved along more than it should have. It's all very well having Jewish schools, but how Jewish are those Jewish schools?
Got it. And so for people who are in the workforce, they're Bnei Torah, what are the other central ideas? We spoke a little bit about being a mensch and making Kiddush Hashem. What are other central ideas that Rabbi Sacks would want to impart on us as we embark on these careers of living lives that are significant and completely aligned with Torah values, but also successful in the career and professional sense as well?
Well, I think you'd want us to be very proud of our Yiddishkeit and not shy away from it at all. I think at the moment, the massive challenge, the biggest challenge of any Jew anywhere in outside Israel, is to defend Israel, because A, half the population, Jewish population of the world lives in Israel, and B, Israel is under attack like never before. I think he would be appalled, absolutely appalled, to see where it's gone to. And it was bad enough even when he was alive. He wrote enough times about anti-Semitism being the virus which it mutates the whole time. And he would be appalled to the lengths at which it has gone in the last 2 years, how anti-Semitism has proliferated and become mainstream, and how you can repeat the libels and the jibes of genocide and colonialism and apartheid enough times, and it's just become mainstream. You repeat enough times, the lie sticks. And I think the other issue which you would really probably want to grapple with, although I don't know how you do it, is the social media, because he wasn't from the social media generation. None of us were. And social media is having a massive effect on the Jewish youth, who are getting their views from places which they shouldn't be. I mean, we know even the United Synagogue, just looking at a recent survey, attitudes towards Israel are far more negative from the under 30s and under 40s. And the older you get, the more people are pro-Israel. That's nothing to do with religion as such. It's to do with what they're being exposed to. And the TikToks and the Instagrams and all the others, they are peddling the filth of and the propaganda and the lies and the anti-Semitism, and our kids are absorbing it. And I think you will be very, very concerned about that. What we can do about it in the public square, I mean, it's more than what we do it in our homes. It's our children. It's our children. Forget about trying to make the Goyim understand, although there is a role in that as well. And if one's got non-Jewish friends, and I think quite a lot of people, there is a private support for Judaism or for Jews in the Israel matter. It's very, very difficult for them if they're exposed to the national broadcaster here, the BBC and others, in this war over the last 2 years. If you weren't a dyed-in-the-wall Jew and Israeli supporter, you would be anti-Israel. I would also be anti-Israel. If the only diet I had of viewing would be the BBC every night broadcasting from Gaza, where they're not even allowed in, so they just take whatever footage they're sent by the Gazans, and quoting the casualty figures from the Gaza Health Ministry without saying this is actually a propaganda organ of the Hamas government, therefore why are you quoting them at all? You would also be anti-Israel. It would be very difficult not to be. So I think Rabbi Sacks would want us to support Israel as much as possible and to clarify the facts. But it has to start at home as well, because it's our kids who have to be convinced of this, not just the non-Jews around us. Because we can see, and I'm sure you find in similar people of university age and beyond in America, those going to college are going to be less sympathetic to Israel than those who were in college 20 years ago.
There's something maybe between the lines of what you're saying that I just wanted to point out and maybe ask you to go a little deeper on, is that a lot of the things that you're talking about and you're focusing on are issues that when you talk about the Jewish communities, much of the Jewish community is not what we would call the Orthodox or Shomer Torah mitzvos or yeshiva community. So it seems that Rabbi Sacks was very much focused and poured a lot of energy into making sure that those Jews are engaged and educated and inspired. So is that also something that we should maybe be a little more careful about and realize that we have a responsibility, not just for the chinuch of our own children who are going to want to send to yeshiva and make into gedolim and rabbanim, and that's all very important, but really make sure that we're thinking about the Jewish education of all Jews, even those who are a little bit different.
For sure. I mean, Kiruv is absolutely essential. It's absolutely essential. There are so many Jews out there who, have, for no fault of their own, have been abandoned by their parents and their grandparents, and they know so little. And so, for sure, and that's why he was writing for a lot of these people, and he was trying to bring them back, not by shoving Torah down their necks, but by, why should I be Jewish? So there's some wonderful little pamphlets he wrote for Rosh Hashanah and Kippur about, the questions you may want to ask and what you should be teaching your children. He was trying to draw people in, and I think he has had a certain degree of influence, but there's so much more we can all do. I mean, if we have the opportunity, I mean, I don't live in that sort of area anymore. I'm not the age to be interacting with kids of that age, but if somebody has access to children of the mainstream in your neck, you are in Israel anyway, so it's a bit difficult. But if you meet with Chilonim, and I think there is in Israel, certainly as a result of this war, there are Chilonim who are coming back or realizing, it's the hatred that comes towards us, which is inspiring something, but to realize, well, we're on our own now. We ought to stick together and perhaps look at our own culture and our own heritage. There's so much to be said for that.
Okay, so let's go to our rapid fire round. 3 short questions, 3 hopefully short answers. We've now transitioned to the winter. We have nice long Friday nights. So what do you like to do at that time?
Well, I spend a lot of my time learning, not because I'm a great person, but simply because during the week, I have too little time to learn. I mean, I do learn every day, but not with the same clear head as you have on a Friday night, or even better on a Shabbos morning. I mean, I go to a very early meeting on Shabbos morning and I spend 2 or 3 hours just sitting and learning when your head is so clear and there's no distractions. During the week, it is difficult to learn. I mean, whatever you're doing, even if you do get up early and learn or go at the end of the day, but your emails are flying there. In the subconscious, there's things going on. Many of my distractions are in a Jewish interest because I'm running a pastin, but it's not the same as Torah learning. You're working for a pastin, and I'm working for a Jewish charity as well, giving legal advice to a Jewish charity. And so everything you're doing is the Shem Shemayim and for the Jewish public, but it's not for your own personal growth. And learning, there's nothing better than to learn, actually. I mean, and those are the times. Friday nights are not so easy. You often have social, you have people, friends round, and we invite friends, in which case Friday nights doesn't get spent in the most positive way. if I'm at home and there's lonely Friday nights with just the two of us with my wife, and it's really early night because here shops comes in at ridiculously early times in midwinter, then I would go to sleep for about 10 minutes for a power nap because otherwise, and then you can carry on.
Amazing, amazing.
The learning is the best thing, but then not everybody's for learning. I understand not everybody's got the Sitzfleisch. I've been blessed with abilities. I'm not a great learner, but I have got the ability to at least concentrate.
Beautiful, beautiful. So you've been through so many of Rabbi Sacks' writing before they saw the light of day. Do you have a favorite book or essay or idea from Rabbi Sacks?
Probably not a favorite idea. I mean, he writes brilliantly, and I mean, his kind of conversations are beautiful, nugget-sized Divrei Torah. I'm brought up in a slightly different tradition where the Divrei Torah are not full of, non-Jewish philosophers and bits of history, but it was always a delight to read. I mean, they are a delight to read, and I enjoy all his books. I mean, something, if you don't have a classical education, to read his books is a bit of a compensation because you can learn so much about what you missed not going to a top-class university and not spending your youthful years studying secular subjects, because there's so much there. He'll teach you about psychological experience, which you'd never otherwise know about. He'll teach you about philosophical trends. I like so much of his stuff. His Machzorim, in particular, have got fantastic introductions to each of the Chagim, which are really, really well thought. Those favorite of mine, yes.
Amazing, amazing, beautiful. So now, final question. If you were forced today to leave your job, leave the legal profession, leave the Jewish community work that you've been doing, and choose a new job in a new industry, anything that you want in the world, maybe something you dreamed of doing as a kid or have an itch to do, what would that be?
Try it, because I've done enough. I mean, I'm well past retirement age. A travel guide, maybe because I love travel. I love Jewish history. I could take people through Europe and give them quite a good go at explaining what happened in these particular places, who lived there. I mean, I've done a lot of Europe in terms of Jewish history, and there is a lot there. So probably a travel guide.
Amazing. Mr. David Frei, thank you so much for joining us on Shtark Tank. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing all these experiences, memories, and thoughts about Rabbi Sacks and his legacy. Thank you. Thank you.